She gave me divorce papers at our anniversary dinner, right there in front of everyone. She slid the envelope across the table with a smile sharp enough to cut glass and said, "I'm done with this marriage." The room went silent for a moment, then laughter erupted. Her friends giggled. Her lover raised his glass and winked at me, as if I'd been the fool all along. They thought I'd break, they thought I'd beg. Instead, I signed the papers without a word. And then I reached into my jacket, pulled out the house keys and placed them on the table, but not in front of her. I slid them straight toward her sister. Backhand index pointing right, subscribe, like, and leave a comment because what happened next silenced the room. The restaurant was everything she had chosen. Upscale, expensive, draped in soft candlelight that bounced off polished silverware and crystal glasses. A place where the wine list ran longer than the food menu, and the waiters carried themselves with the stiff grace of stage actors. The table was crowded with her circle. Colleagues, friends, a few relatives, all gathered to celebrate our anniversary. I had thought, perhaps foolishly, that the night might still carry some semblance of romance, that maybe she had planned something to remind us of what we once were. The low jazz drifting from the corner, the flicker of candles against her blonde hair, the way her dress shimmered in the light. All of it should have belonged to a love story. Instead, it was the setting for my humiliation. From the moment I sat down, I felt the coldness in her tone, the sharpness in her laughter. She leaned close to Daniel, her friend, though everyone knew better, whispering in his ear, brushing his sleeve, laughing a little too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. Every so often she would glance at me with that thin smile, the one that said she was already gone. I sat still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my face calm. Inside, I felt the heat rise, not of desperation but of clarity. I had seen the signs for months. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the way she stopped looking at me like I was even in the room. Tonight was just the performance, the final act she had rehearsed to make her exit grand and cruel. The wine flowed, the laughter grew louder, and then she reached into her bag. She didn't hesitate, didn't try to soften the blow. She pulled out the envelope, thick with neatly printed papers, and tossed it onto my plate with a theatrical flair. "Happy anniversary," she said, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Consider this my gift to you. I'm filing for divorce." For a heartbeat, the table went still. Then, like a dam breaking, laughter spilled out. Her friends clapped her on the back. Daniel leaned closer with a smirk, and even some of the relatives chuckled uncomfortably. To them, I was the defeated man, the joke of the evening. I looked at the papers, then at her. Her eyes glittered with triumph. Daniel raised his glass, smirking as if he'd already won. And around me, the sound of their laughter pressed close, testing me, waiting to see if I would break. But I didn't give them the satisfaction. My hand was steady as I lifted the pen, signed where she had marked the lines, and slid the papers back across the table. Not a word, not a plea, not a protest. The silence I offered was louder than any argument I could have made. She blinked, her smile faltering for the briefest second before she covered it with another laugh. I leaned back in my chair, let the chatter resume, and waited. They thought it was over, that the night belonged to her. But they didn't see the weight of the keys in my pocket, or the plan that had been quietly waiting for its moment. The laughter that rolled around the table after I slid the signed papers back was the kind that cut deeper than words. It wasn't joyous laughter. It was mocking, smug, the sound of people who thought they were watching a man's final defeat. The clinking of glasses, the exaggerated toasts, the way Daniel leaned back in his chair with a grin plastered across his face. All of it felt rehearsed, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment. Sarah's voice rose above the noise, sharper, more triumphant. "See? He doesn't even fight back. He never did. That's why I'm leaving." She tilted her glass toward Daniel and pressed it against his. He winked at her and then, just to twist the knife, turned his smirk in my direction as if daring me to respond. I didn't. I sat still, my hand resting loosely against the tablecloth, my eyes calm. On the surface I was quiet, but inside, I could feel the weight of the moment building, a storm gathering with deliberate patience. The restaurant itself seemed to conspire with them. The golden glow of the chandeliers made every sparkle of jewelry glisten, every polished wine glass shine, every sneer brighter. The room smelled of roasted meats and garlic butter, but beneath it lingered something acrid, the stench of arrogance that had filled the air the moment Sarah pulled those papers from her bag. I scanned the table without moving my head, watching each reaction, each face. Her friends leaned closer to one another, whispering behind manicured hands. One of them glanced at me with a look that was equal parts pity and amusement. Relatives shook their heads, some smiling uncomfortably, as though they didn't know whether to laugh or stay silent. It was all theater, and Sarah was the star. She crossed her legs, smoothed her dress, and spoke again, louder this time so every corner of the table could hear. I've wasted enough years pretending. Tonight, I start fresh, with a man who actually knows what he wants. She slid her hand over Daniel's, squeezing it gently, her gaze fixed on me with the smug assurance of a woman convinced she had won. Daniel lifted his chin, his confidence oozing from every careless movement. He raised his glass again, muttering something about new beginnings, and the table cheered. I could feel their eyes pressing on me, waiting for a reaction, waiting for the scene to be complete. But I gave them nothing. No anger, no words, no visible crack. My silence unsettled some of them. I could see it in the way a cousin shifted uncomfortably, the way one friend glanced at Sarah with doubt flickering in her eyes. People expected explosions. They expected pleas or fights, not stillness. My calm was louder than their chaos, though they didn't realize it yet. The waiter approached, awkward and uncertain, carrying plates of steaming entrees, his eyes darting between us as though he had walked into a storm. He set the plates down one by one, his hands trembling slightly when Sarah laughed again, this time leaning her head against Daniel's shoulder as though to underline her victory. The smell of seared steak and garlic mashed potatoes filled the air, but I barely noticed. I watched her, not with rage, but with clarity. Her performance was flawless in her own mind, but every actor forgets the audience eventually. And she had forgotten that not all eyes at that table were hers to command. Across from her sat Emily, her sister, quiet, poised, almost invisible in the chaos. She hadn't laughed once. She hadn't clapped, hadn't smirked. She had only watched. Her brown hair framed her face, her expression unreadable, her fork untouched beside her plate. Her gaze shifted between Sarah, Daniel, and me, her lips pressed tightly together as though she was holding something in. I caught her eye for a brief moment. She didn't look away. Unlike the others, there was no mockery in her stare, no pity. Only something sharp, something that felt almost like recognition. Sarah noticed the glance, of course. She always noticed. Her smile grew wider, and she reached out to squeeze Daniel's hand again. Louder now, bolder, as though daring everyone at the table to witness her triumph. "This is what happiness looks like," she declared, her voice dripping with self-satisfaction. "Not what I pretended to have all these years. More laughter, more toasts, more smirks." The table was alive with their performance. I leaned back in my chair, breathing evenly, my hands loose, my face calm. The weight of the keys in my jacket pocket pressed against me like iron, heavy, deliberate. They had been there all along, waiting for their moment. Waiting for the exact second when silence would turn into something no one could laugh at. Sarah thought she was orchestrating the scene, thought every word, every laugh, every mocking glance was hers to control. But what she didn't understand was that the play had already shifted. The real act hadn't even begun. The laughter began to dull after a while, not because Sarah or Daniel lost their energy, but because repetition kills novelty. People laughed out of obligation more than joy, the kind of nervous laughter that fills space rather than celebrates it. I noticed the change before they did. Her friends stopped leaning in so eagerly. A few of the relatives shifted their attention to their plates, and even the waiters seemed to linger less when they passed by our table. But Sarah didn't care. She was glowing with triumph, basking in what she thought was my destruction. Every word out of her mouth was sharper than the last, every chuckle aimed at me like a dart. Daniel fed her lines to play off of, nodding smugly, grinning as though he had already claimed victory over me. Years? Sarah said, holding her glass up again. I wasted years with a man who had no drive, no passion, nothing to give. And now look at him, signing away our marriage without a fight. What else could he do? The words were cruel, pointed, and loud enough for nearby tables to hear. A ripple of laughter spread among her circle, though softer this time, less certain. Daniel chuckled, placing a hand on her shoulder. But the way his eyes darted around betrayed his awareness that the room's energy was not quite what it had been. I sat still, my knife and fork untouched, my gaze calm, my silence unshakable. I let her words hang in the air, let them echo until they felt hollow. Because silence, when wielded at the right moment, does not mean defeat. It means preparation. I felt Emily's eyes on me again. She hadn't moved much all evening, but her stillness was not the stillness of weakness. It was the stillness of someone listening, someone waiting. She hadn't laughed at a single one of Sarah's jokes, hadn't offered Daniel so much as a polite smile. She simply sat there, her posture straight, her hands folded near her plate, her gaze sharp and steady. When Sarah's barbs flew across the table, Emily didn't even flinch. She just watched. And when Sarah raised her glass once more, laughing as she pressed her lips against Daniel's cheek in a mock toast to freedom, Emily's eyes shifted briefly to me, and in them I saw the recognition of what Sarah had overlooked, a recognition that cut deeper than words. The waiter came again, this time with dessert menus, his hands shaking slightly as he placed them down. He had been listening too. Everyone had. Sarah had turned the dinner into a spectacle, and in doing so, she had given the audience more than she realized. I glanced around, catching the subtle discomfort in faces she assumed were allies. A cousin looking down at her plate, a friend sipping wine too quickly, a relative whispering to her partner under her breath. They had come for a celebration but had been dragged into a performance of cruelty. Daniel, oblivious or perhaps unwilling to see the cracks, leaned back in his chair with a grin, as though he were king of the table. "Don't look so tense," he said toward me, smirking. "You'll thank us someday." His words were smug, his tone dripping with arrogance, but even he lacked the conviction he had carried earlier. His laugh was a little too forced, his confidence a little too loud. I didn't answer. I let the silence answer for me, the silence that was no longer just mine, but shared by those who had grown weary of the performance. Sarah waved her hand dismissively, her eyes gleaming with false victory. "He has nothing left to say," she declared, her voice bright with triumph. "Nothing left to give. This marriage is over, and so is his place in my life." She leaned into Daniel, kissed him lightly on the cheek, and raised her glass one last time. "To freedom," she said. The toast was met with scattered clinks of glasses, half-hearted smiles, and nervous glances. The performance was dragging, the audience restless. But Sarah didn't see it. She thought she had already won, that the night had crowned her the victor. I placed my hands flat on the table, slow, deliberate. The sound was soft, but in the lull of fading laughter, it carried. The conversation faltered, glasses froze midair, and every head turned toward me. Even Sarah's voice caught in her throat, her smile stiffening. I reached into my jacket pocket, the weight of the keys pressed against my palm, cold and metallic, the symbol of everything she thought she controlled. Slowly, carefully, I drew them out, the faint jingle slicing through the silence like a blade. All eyes followed the movement, curiosity sparking, unease spreading like a shadow across the table. I set the papers aside, slid the keys onto the polished wood, and let them rest there, gleaming under the chandelier's glow. My eyes never left hers. Sarah stared, confused, her smile faltering, her breath catching as she tried to read my stillness. The laughter around the table had died completely. I didn't speak yet. I wanted the silence to grow, to press against them all, to make them feel the weight of what was coming before a single word passed my lips. The keys lay on the table, gleaming under the chandelier, and for a moment the entire restaurant seemed to freeze. Forks hovered in midair, glasses paused halfway to lips, and all eyes shifted from me to the small metal bundle resting on the linen tablecloth. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with tension, and I let it stretch. Sarah's smirk faltered for the first time that night, her voice catching as she tried to force a laugh. "What's this supposed to be?" she asked, the edge in her tone betraying the fear she couldn't hide. I didn't answer immediately. I leaned back, folded my hands together, and let the weight of the moment build. Every second that passed turned the air heavier, the anticipation sharper. Then, slowly, I pushed the keys forward across the table, not toward Sarah, but toward Emily. The sound of metal sliding across wood was louder than the laughter had been moments ago. Sarah's eyes widened, her lips parting as if she couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. Emily sat motionless at first, her expression steady, though her fingers twitched slightly as the keys came to rest in front of her. She didn't look down at them. She looked at me, her eyes locking onto mine with a clarity that cut through the entire room. "I signed your papers," I said finally, my voice calm, even. "You can have your freedom." I turned my gaze toward Sarah, her face draining of color. "But the house? That doesn't go to you." The words were simple, but they struck like a hammer. A murmur ran through the table, whispers breaking the silence as people leaned in closer, trying to make sense of what was happening. Sarah's hand shot out, trembling, as if she could snatch the keys away before they meant something she couldn't undo. But Emily moved quicker. With a steady hand, she placed her palm firmly over the keys, claiming them without hesitation. The motion was quiet, graceful, but it roared in the silence. Gasps erupted from every corner of the table. Sarah's face contorted, shock turning to rage. "You can't. What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice rising shrill and desperate. She turned to Emily, her sister, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Tell him this is a joke. Tell him you don't want them." But Emily didn't look at her. Her gaze stayed locked on me, calm, unwavering, as if she had been waiting for this moment just as long as I had. Slowly, deliberately, she nodded once. It was subtle, but the meaning was clear. She accepted. The room erupted. Friends whispered furiously, relatives exchanged horrified glances, and Daniel pushed back from the table with a scowl, his confidence shattered. The smirk he had worn all evening was gone, replaced by the expression of a man who had just realized he was standing on the wrong side of history. He muttered something under his breath, but no one cared to listen. All eyes were on Sarah, who sat frozen, her lips trembling, her hands clawing at the tablecloth as though it could ground her. Her laughter, once so loud, had vanished into the same silence she had mocked me for keeping. "You planned this?" she spat finally, her voice breaking. "You've been waiting to humiliate me." The irony of her words hung heavy in the air. She had dragged me into this dinner to break me, to turn me into the evening's entertainment. And yet here she was, shattered in front of the very same audience she had tried to impress. Emily lifted the keys gently, the metal glinting under the light as she held them in her hand. She turned her head then, finally looking at her sister. The look in her eyes was sharp, unforgiving. She didn't need to say anything. The gesture spoke louder than any words. Sarah's jaw dropped, her face twisting in disbelief as her own sister accepted the gift she thought had always been hers. I rose slowly from my chair, collecting my jacket with calm precision. I didn't gloat, didn't raise my voice. I simply stood tall, my silence more powerful than any speech. The eyes of every guest followed me, some in awe, others in shock, but all of them recognizing the shift. I was no longer the man mocked at the table. I was the man who had turned the entire evening upside down with nothing more than patience and timing. Sarah tried one last desperate plea, her voice cracking. "You'll regret this," she shouted, her words echoing too loudly in the hushed restaurant. But her threats rang hollow. No one defended her, not even Daniel. He sat stiffly, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the floor, unwilling to meet her gaze. She was alone, abandoned in the very performance she had orchestrated. I slipped my wallet from my pocket, placed cash neatly on the table for my meal, and turned to leave. My final glance landed on Sarah, and I saw the exact moment realization crushed her. Her triumph had dissolved into ashes, her laughter into silence, her victory into humiliation. She had given me divorce papers in front of her lover and her friends, certain I would crumble. Instead, I had walked away with my dignity, and she had been left with nothing but the weight of her own choices. And as I stepped out into the cool night air, I understood something I would never forget. Sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is the sharpest blade of all. Subscribe, like, and leave a comment if you want more stories where betrayal ends not with rage, but with quiet, devastating truth.